Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I'm John, this has been a True and welcome back to Fallout 76, because we need to have a chat. So, there's an old adage about frogs. It goes that if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump straight back out again. But if you just put it in warm water, and then very cautiously raise the temperature, the frog will stay put, even as it becomes less and less comfortable. Because it's happening slowly, the frog doesn't realise anything's wrong. Now, as biologists have been pointing out since the 19th century, frogs don't actually do this, because this is a very easy thing to test, and some scientists apparently just really don't like frogs. But it is very useful as a metaphor for how it came to be that despite being a Fallout YouTuber who has fairly extensively covered Fallout 76 over the last year, I've never really paid too much attention to the Atom Store. You see, when Fallout 76 launched, the Atom Store didn't really seem to be that much of a big deal to me. Even more than that, it didn't even really seem relevant to me. I accepted that an online game would need some form of ongoing monetization to pay for the service, and if there were going to be microtransactions, a cosmetic-only shop where you could earn currency in-game seemed like the best deal. It was certainly better than loot boxes. In a shop, you just pick the item you want, and either pay for that if that's what you want to do, or earn and use in-game currency, or just ignore it because they're cosmetics. The water dish seemed fine, the temperature was pleasant. But a lot's happened over the last year, and while much has been said about Fallout 76, I couldn't really find any attempt to properly tell the full story of the Atom Store, so sit down and buckle up, folks, because there's a lot of stuff to cover here. So, let me take you back in time to November 14th, 2018. Fallout 76 has just come out, and so is the first iteration of the Atom Shop, and it's pretty much entirely what we were told to expect. It's a shop full of some cosmetic items, some clothing, some hairstyles, some player icons, nothing desperately controversial. Naturally, as the game's got a giant pile of people playing at launch day and immediately afterwards, it receives fairly regular updates. Some of the first things that get added into it are things like the Starlet Sniper, the Back to Nature clothing set, nothing desperately dramatic really. The biggest controversy at the time is the pricing seems a little bit on the high side, with fairly mundane clothing costing the equivalent of about £5 and more like £10 to £12 for power armor sets. But at the time, there isn't really much backlash against this because the game seems to be showering players with atoms just for completing challenges in game, so no one seems to be complaining too loudly, not just yet. But then something very interesting indeed happens, which is November 23rd, Black Friday. The price of Fallout 76 drops to only $40. And before the end of the month, some retailers would have it down to $35. Basically, almost half the price from what it was at launch, which I remind you was only a couple of weeks before. Naturally, this annoys some people who pre-ordered and paid full price. And there was a lot of reporting on this at the time, but I found that reporting sort of missed one of the most interesting things. There was a huge amount of focus on how this was a response to what were presumably weaker than anticipated sales, and yet people sort of overlooked the more interesting half of the equation, which is what did this mean for Fallout 76's financial blend going forwards? You see, back in the day, you just made a game and then you sold it. The money you made was based on how many copies you sold. That was it. But things have got a lot more complicated since then, with many games now built around recurring revenue, making money on an ongoing basis. As an example, earlier in 2019, 2K revealed that they made under half of their income from actually selling games. It also led to some downright odd accounting when 2K revealed they'd had one of their best financial quarters of all time, in a quarter when they hadn't actually launched any video games. Yeah, recurring revenue can be an odd thing. In short, the profit from actually selling a game might matter a lot less than the revenue that follows thereafter. It's the same logic that means that in many cases, games consoles are actually sold to loss, on the understanding that once you have the console in somebody's home, they'll be buying games for it for years to come. Same basic principle here on a much smaller scale. Make less upfront, make more thereafter. Now, whether Bethesda planned ahead of launch for the price to actually drop that quickly or not is something we'll never know for sure, along with whether or not it was in response to weaker than anticipated sales. What I will say is, I doubt it was done in a panic. There was a calculation here, but that calculation most likely means that if the game was going to make less money per sale, therefore, each person buying it needed to yield more average ongoing revenue. And with that in mind, we enter the most magical time of the year, the holiday season, and Bethesda had plans, because something new appeared on November the 30th, and that was the Daredevil outfit. Brand new piece of apparel, costing 1,600 atoms. Quite a lot, that's about £12 or thereabouts, but there was a new twist. It was only available for a limited time. If you didn't buy it in the next 2 days, you didn't get it at all. And Bethesda were only just getting started. Very soon after, there will be the Cowhide outfit, 800 atoms, only available for 1 day. Lightning Tattoo, only available for 1 day. Mothman Frame, only available for 1 day. A special fruit hat, 1 day. Blackbird paints, 1 day. And by mid-December, we would have 1 day limited access to doors, floor tiles, and a massive red rocket sign. Now, this is when the first bit of heat gets put under the water bath. And to explain why this was bad, let's have a quick look at how atoms work and where they come from. Now obviously you could just buy atoms, but a big part of Bethesda's pre-launch marketing was that you could also earn them in-game rather than buying them. This was done through 2 mechanisms. The first method was challenges related to your personal character. Basically, you just went around playing the game, and the game congratulated you by giving you some atoms. So the very first time you destroy a robot, 3 stim packs for you. Destroy 10, you get yourself 10 atoms, but you may immediately notice as we actually go up to the next 20 atoms for killing robots, yeah, you need to kill 101. The thing about this, much like leveling up in many online games, is it happens very quickly at the beginning of the game and then gets progressively slower as time went on. In fact, hang on, let's just skip to the top here. Here we go, my character's level 86, I've put well over 100 hours into this game, and I still haven't got to the next robot atom reward. So that would be destroying robots with a pistol. I was a pistol user. I'm only up to 823 robots destroyed. So yeah, that slows down a lot. This I think is why there wasn't much backlash at the very beginning of Fallout 76's life. Because even though the prices were a bit on the steep side, people were being showered with atoms from the personal challenges. As time went by, those atoms started drying up, leading on to the second, more reliable source of atoms. And that was the daily and weekly challenges. So basically, every single day, understandably, you could log in and there'd be a bunch of challenges. If you did all of them, you'd be awarded about 50 to 60 atoms a day. And the weekly challenges, of course, would be more difficult, but you had longer to complete them, and the rewards tended to be a little bit on the higher side. So you get maybe 150 atoms if you completed all of those in a week. I should say though, some of these could be very, very time consuming indeed. Tracking down 10 different sorts of alcohol, that can actually take a while. Anyway, if we add all that together, basically from the challenges, you've got maybe 600 atoms a week or so if you log in every day and do literally every challenge. And now I think you can see how the mathematics of the situation starts to present a bit of a problem, which is part of the promise that was made by Bethesda was that you could buy things simply by earning atoms in-game. Because if something shows up costing 1,400 atoms that's only available for 1 day, you physically can't earn enough from the challenges in-game to be able to afford that. Now in theory, your character might be able to meet enough personal character challenges to get enough atoms together to buy the item without having to actually spend any money, but as those get progressively harder and slower to come by, that's only a temporary solution, and as people's characters got to a higher and higher level, it became less and less workable. So the number of timed exclusives was going up, but on December 15th, everything got a whole lot worse. That was the day the Holiday Emotes bundle was added to the Atoms store. Now the price of that was 2,400 atoms, but don't worry, it's been reduced to 1,200 atoms. What a good deal! There was just one problem. It had never actually been in the store before, and that was followed the next day by the Coming to Town Christmas bundle, discounted to 2,000 atoms, down from 3,000, which it had never actually been, because both of these items arrived in the store pre-discounted. Now that's obviously a bit on the dodgy side, and depending on what country you're in, there are actually some very strict rules about how items can't be marked as discounted until they've actually been sold at the original price for a certain amount of time. A couple of days later, the discounted labelling had just quietly disappeared, Bethesda realising this was not a very good idea. But they were joined by another 2,000 atom Christmas bundle, and there was plenty of Christmas cheer yet to come. 1,200 atoms for some Christmas trees, time limited to 2 days. A waving Santa, 800 atoms, 2 days. Christmas-like power armor, 1,000 atoms, 7 days limited, and more beyond that too. Basically a hell of a lot of time-limited Christmas items. But time moved on and Christmas came to an end, probably somewhere around late December 25th, if I had to guess. And in the new year, there was something new making its first appearance inside the Atom Store. And that was a sale. An actual sale, I mean, not the slightly confusing Christmas sale that probably wasn't actually a thing. The 2076 glasses, which had been in the Atom Store from the very first day, were now being reduced from their original price, 760 atoms, down to 380, 50% off. Now, we need to talk about this in detail because there's a lot of interesting things to discuss around pricing and discounting when you're selling purely online items, effectively selling data in what we in marketing would typically call perceived value. And this is something I know a bit about because before I was a YouTuber, as many of you will know, I worked for many years in marketing. So a lot of this makes a lot of sense to me. So, okay, perceived value. This is a bit complicated, so let me give you a really simple example. There's a very old truism in restaurants that many people order the second cheapest bottle of wine on a wine list. This is because many people don't really understand wine that well, so they don't want to spend extra money on expensive wine when they don't see the advantage of it. But they also don't want to order the cheapest wine as they assume that's the worst one and they don't want to look cheap in company. Therefore, the second cheapest bottle of wine. The point of that story is that people come up with an idea of what something is worth based on contextual information, such as what other similar things cost, because often we don't have enough information or expertise to know whether something actually is good value or not. And this is where we get to Fallout 76's time-limited sales. You see, in physical shops, sales are often used to shift stock to make space for new stuff, but in the Atom Store, that doesn't really make sense. There's no stock, so an online sale in this environment is much more likely to be about perceived value. Because if you compare an item at its full price with the exact same item at half that price, then the latter can often be perceived as good value. And in a time limit to that deal, you've got some good old fear of missing out tossed in. But does that actually make sense when it comes to online microtransactions when what's being sold is data? Physical items have a cost price, a cost that it takes to manufacture it. Some items cost more than others because they cost more to produce. But why in Fallout 76 do power armor skins cost around 1,500 atoms, whereas regular clothing costs more in the mid to high hundreds, and hats only cost a couple of hundred? It's not because they cost more to manufacture, these are just numbers that were invented by Bethesda. There's no reason whatsoever why 380 atoms for a pair of glasses is better value than 760 atoms. But if you flag something as being half price, and only half price if you buy it today, then plenty of people will decide it is better value and potentially grab it. And clearly, they did. Because while this was the first sale, it most definitely would not be the last. These things completely exploded across the Atom Store. Over the course of February and into early March, there was a massive expansion of flash sales. These would start happening pretty much constantly. I should clarify, by the way, Bethesda didn't invent any of this. These are old, well-established marketing tricks that just happen to have a particular relevance to gaming microtransactions. And it's something well worth keeping in mind in any gaming marketplace, not just this one. And then another very major mistake was made. The date is January 29th, 2019, and a couple of new outfits have just been introduced into the store. The Unstoppable outfits, modelled after a team of superheroes in the Fallout universe. They cost 800 atoms each, but almost immediately, a banner was noticed on the front page of Fallout 76. If you and your teammates were dressed up as the Unstoppables, all of you would gain bonus health. In short, there was a clear demonstrable gameplay advantage that was giving some people a competitive advantage over other people. The very specific thing that Bethesda said was not going to be allowed to happen. Obviously, this bonus was pulled pretty much straight away. But despite those hiccups, February in general was actually a pretty good time for the Atom Store, with a series of updates arriving that didn't really have the large number of time-limited items that had characterised Christmas. For example, we had the Playtime update, followed by Terror in the Night, and then Rest and Relaxation. And in pretty much all of these updates, there were basically no time-limited items whatsoever. There was just new stuff entering the store that people could save up for if that's what they wanted to do. It was probably the best month in the Atom Store's history in terms of working as people had anticipated it would ahead of launch. Even more encouragingly, when the Valentine's Day special event rolled around, Share the Love, it looked like Bethesda had learnt the lessons of Christmas and realised they might have gone a bit over the top during the holiday period. As once again, there were no time-limited items. Everything that was added, people could save up for, if that's what they wanted. So, I'd argue that February was probably the best month the Atom Store ever had. And then, February 22nd happened. And something very interesting indeed showed up, and it got almost no attention at the time because it was so damn insignificant. But it would have some very significant consequences. On February 22nd, the Mothman frame came back. Now I know that sounds like absolutely nothing. In fact, you may have forgotten I already mentioned the Mothman frame about 10 minutes ago or thereabout. This was a time-limited item introduced back in December that was only available for a single day. It was very clearly sold as an exclusive. Buy it this day or it's gone. It is only available for one day. But on February 22nd, it came back. Having appeared as a single-day flash item on December 7th, it returned for another single-day flash sale on February 22nd. Now, we've touched on this briefly a moment ago with time-limited flash sales and the idea of generating a fear of missing out on value, and with the Christmas time-limited items and how they created scenarios where it wasn't feasible to earn enough atoms in the allotted time that an item was available to purchase. But in the return of the Mothman frame, this was taken to a new level, and it clearly highlights the phenomenon of engineered scarcity. Now, as we've mentioned a moment ago, there's no stock for data. You can't run out of Mothman frames, but scarcity is a really great driver to encourage people to purchase. Buy now, only available while supplies last, all that business. And so scarcity must be created by taking the item away. But the return of the Mothman frame demonstrates how artificial this is. Items can be flagged as being about to disappear, have a small sale attached to them to maximise both perceived value and the fear of missing out, and then get brought back later. And this can keep being done indefinitely. With no stock to worry about, that data can just keep being removed and later restored, effectively forever. And this clearly worked, because Bethesda pretty soon after this started doing it a lot. It's referred to in the store as items being sent to the vault, i.e. they're about to be removed from the storefront, a process by which a bunch of items are briefly discounted and then removed, while other items that had previously been time limited and removed then returned in their place. The first major instance of this was on April the 2nd, when many items, including some that had been in the store from the very beginning, were briefly put on sale and then removed. And as I say, this process was very heavily expanded. In fact, if we go over to the very most recent update to the time of recording, the December the 3rd update, a bunch of Free States items which had previously been sent to the vault have returned. 16 items in fact, with 2 bundles covering some of them, but only for 1 week. While at the same time, a bunch of items are leaving with a final sale, together with 7 one-day flash sales. As I say, this is now hugely widespread. But, so far, with the exception of the Christmas sales that weren't really sales and the Unstoppables issue in January, we've really just been discussing the introduction of marketing techniques. It's not great, sure, but it's the same tactics you'd see from pretty much any retailer. But then we entered March and the waters started to heat up. You see, on March 26th, the Survival Mode Beta began, a brand new mode in which people were free to attack each other without any limitations whatsoever. Up until that point in Adventure Mode, you were able to shoot other characters, but unless they actually fired back and thus formally began a duel, the damage you were inflicting was significantly reduced. But it still existed, and you were also able to attack other people's camps, again with massively reduced damage, but you were able to do so. Now, while many people were focused on Survival Mode, something kind of slipped under the radar a bit, which is, at the same time as it came out, changes were made to Adventure Mode to remove some of those systems I was just describing a moment ago. Now, non-hostile damage was reduced to 0. In short, if you tried to shoot another player, it would do literally nothing. And those confirmation the same day, the same protection would subsequently be extended to camps. In short, outside of specific PvP events and workshop disputes, there would now be 0 PvP inside Adventure Mode. It would be exclusively limited to the new Survival Mode. However, within a few months, Survival Mode would be shut down, with accompanying messaging indicating that Nuclear Winter was going to be filling the role of the PvP mode from now on, clearly indicating that Adventure Mode was now effectively seen as a PvE non-competitive mode. And that's very important because we need to go into the exact promises that were made by Bethesda about the Atom Store. Because while it was generally reported ahead of Fallout 76's launch that the store was going to be cosmetics only, that wasn't actually the message that Bethesda had been broadcasting most of the time. Instead, pre-release interviews were very clear. The Atom Store would confer no competitive advantage, which is very clearly distinct from cosmetics only. So, let's just say as a thought experiment, what if you were to remove pretty much all the competitive aspects of the game, leaving adventure mode as pretty much entirely a PvE cooperative world? Well, technically, at that point, giving people items that provide gameplay advantages isn't actually providing a competitive advantage, right? After all, we're all on the same team and there's no competition anymore, so if you sort of squint a bit, less than a month later, the first utility item was released, the repair kit. Now, the repair kit was a very simple item. Basically, as you'd probably guess from the title, you could use it to instantaneously repair any weapon or any piece of armour. And the argument used by Bethesda when this was launched is very simple. These items are offering convenience, not advantage, and thus, they're fine. However, I'd argue a very important line was crossed at this moment. You see, up to this point, weapons could only be repaired with scrap, and scrap was acquired by looting. As I've discussed at length in my own video about what went wrong with Fallout 76 and how to fix it, the scrap gathering rate is relatively slow in this game, as the component yield per item has been reduced from Fallout 4. But thanks to Repair Kit, you can now skip component gathering for weapon maintenance. In short, less grind, more play. This also means there's suddenly a financial benefit to Bethesda if players get bored of travelling around and gathering scrap for maintenance because they can just pay to skip it. In effect, this is very similar to an XP boost item, like Ubisoft has been using recently, a paid mechanism that speeds up the game and thereby creates a financial incentive to make the default experience slower so they can sell you a solution to a problem they created. So that brings us to April 23rd, and that's not all that was going on at that point. One other thing I do want to draw attention to, and just keep your eye on this as we go forward, the price of new items entering the shop that were time limited really started to go up as time went by. Roughly at this point, end of April into the beginning of May, there was the 4 Riders of the Apocalypse event, where basically 4 items of time-limited power armor were introduced one by one into the Atom Store, each costing 1,400 atoms, at the exact same time as the Nuka Shine power armor was introduced into the store, also costing 1,400 atoms, also available for a single week. In short, there were some very expensive time-limited items floating around simultaneously, not wholly unlike what had happened back in December 2018. But there was one other new idea that had just shown up as well, and this one was very, very interesting indeed. On June the 10th, Bethesda launched the E3 bundle. Basically, if you bought 1,000 atoms, normally you would get a bonus of an extra 100 atoms, but during E3, if you bought that 1,000, you get yourself an extra 500, together with 6 repair kits and an exclusive clothing item, the Elder's Battle Coat from Fallout 4. Now, this is again a very important line that we need to note was crossed at this point, because, once again, one of the promises made all along was, if you want to, you can just earn your atoms in-game and spend them in the store. And up to this point, that did technically remain true. Sure, huge numbers of time-limited items were introduced that cost thousands and thousands of atoms that might only be available for a single day or a single week, but, in theory, if you'd been saving up your atoms, you could buy them. The Elder's Battle Coat was the first item that could not be purchased under any circumstances with in-game currency, because the only way to obtain it was by buying this special 1,000 atom bundle. In short, you paid money, or you didn't get it at all. Regardless, it does rather seem to have worked, because it was repeated twice almost immediately. In July, Bethesda did the QuakeCon bundle, an almost identical deal that got you the Revolutionary General's uniform, and then in August, the Gamescom bundle, again pretty much identical, but this time handing over the arguably much more desirable and recognisable Mechanist outfit. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because we're not actually done with June yet. In fact, we're not even nearly done with June. 2 very big things happened in the second half of June. First, Nuclear Winter began, and it had a rather interesting twist to it, which is the only items you're allowed to wear in Nuclear Winter were those from the Atom Store. Now, Part of the reason why the original Atom Store never really bugged me in Fallout 76 was there were a huge number of other outfits I could wear anyway. There's no shortage of outfits in Adventure Mode. In fact, I've got some rather snazzy ones I wouldn't want to trade out with the Atom Store stuff. I'd rather like what I've already got. But in Nuclear Winter, all of that changed. Either you got it from the Atom Store, or you went in the default jumpsuit. Now, that might not seem like the worst thing in the world. Again, we're just talking about cosmetics, except maybe we're not. Because let's just take a look at Nuclear Winter. Now, on both the Nuclear Winter maps, you may notice something, which is there's an awful lot of trees, a lot of brush, a lot of browns and greens, basically a very large amount of rural environment, which you'll spend a lot of time crawling through, not wanting to be seen. Because in Nuclear Winter, generally, whichever team sees the other first is going to have a very significant advantage. Now, by default, and if you never go into the Atom Store, you're going into that environment in a bright blue jumpsuit with shiny gold trim on it. However, there are certain items that at various points you've been able to get from the Atom Store, like for example, various forms of camouflage gear, which a case could certainly be made might give you a certain advantage going up against people wearing, once again, bright blue and gold jumpsuits. But on June 25th, something very, very important happened, which is accompanying patch 10.5, a new type of bundle entered the shop, which began with the Mothman bundle. A bundle which had something very, very special about it, which is it was made up of items you could buy individually. All except for one. The best one. The smoke machine. The only smoke machine at the time in Fallout 76. And if you wanted to get hold of that smoke machine, the only way to do it was to buy the entire bundle. 1,500 atoms, only available for 7 days. This was the first time that had ever happened, where a single exclusive item was being bundled with items that otherwise you could have bought individually. But it most certainly wouldn't be the last, suggesting it was in fact quite successful. In fact, just a few weeks later, the Green Thumb bundle would do precisely the same thing. Roll forward 2 more weeks to August 6th, 1,500 atoms for the Invasion from the Stars bundle. Again, one exclusive outfit, in with a bunch of stuff that otherwise you could have purchased individually. Yeah, these things became so common, one has to assume they sold very well. Still, I'm once again getting ahead of myself here, because I've sort of skipped over July, and July once again saw a bit of an escalation in the amount of new exclusive stuff entering the store. On July the 2nd, 2 bundles and 2 outfits entered the store. Every single one of them time limited to a single week. Every single one of them costing over 1,000 atoms. In fact, the combined price for all 4 was 5,300 atoms in a single week if you didn't want to miss out on the time limited exclusives. And so time moves forward to August the 20th and patch 12, and a whole bunch of very interesting stuff happened simultaneously. One, the Vault raids began, and while these technically didn't have anything to do with the Atom Store, I would say indirectly they most certainly did, because the Vault raids involve fighting a very, very large number of enemies who will keep throwing themselves at you in waves for a very, very long time indeed. A reminder, guns in Fallout 76 have condition, and even though we played on the easier Vault Raid difficulty, and I went in with a character spec'd with decently high intelligence, whose weapons therefore degraded slightly more slowly than they might do so otherwise, my weapon went from full condition down to broken 2 or 3 times in the course of a single raid. Now, the game never explicitly recommends that you might want to buy some repair kits to go into the Vault raids, but they certainly make life an awful lot easier, and an argument could certainly be made that an uptick in the sale of repair kits would certainly be a foreseeable result of releasing the Vault raids. On top of that, once again, the introduction of time-limited exclusive items started stepping up and up and up. On this occasion, 6 different time-limited raider items were introduced, a combined cost of 4,000 atoms, and on top of that, the Future Tech bundle was released, 1,000 atoms for another bundle, which was made mostly out of items you could have bought individually, aside from one exclusive globe. Want that? You have to buy everything else too. Though perhaps the most infamous thing that was added during that update was the train station signs. Starting from August 20th, there were little portals inside the train stations dotted around Appalachia, which if you clicked on them, took you directly to the Atom Store. Though Bethesda quickly realised that one was going a bit too far, and by September the 10th, those were gone again in patch 13. And speaking of patch 13 on September the 10th, yeah, I feel like this is the point many people feel like the water was really starting to heat up a bit, because this was the day that the fridge and the collection station were added into the game, and a utility section was added into the camp tab in the Atom Store. Now, just in case you missed this, the collection station is basically a little robot that you can set to automatically gather scrap on your behalf. The fridge, meanwhile, means that food degrades a little bit more slowly. Now, the collection station in particular, I think people had some issues with, because the collection station, as I say, was basically a way of producing scrap. Not much scrap, mind, but you've got to remember, scrap is the single most important currency in Fallout 76 by quite some way. Scrap does everything. Build your weapons, maintain your armor, build your camp, everything. Everything is done by scrap. But technically, of course, as we actually discussed before, this isn't actually really giving anybody a competitive advantage, because these days, adventure mode is pretty much just a PvE mode, and these items have no relevance to nuclear winter whatsoever. So, once again, you're not really selling a competitive advantage, you're selling convenience, which is not cosmetics, but sort of sits uncomfortably in the middle. That wasn't enough, however, to stop a quite significant backlash. People were not desperately thrilled by the fridge and the collection station, because it felt like the most explicit example yet of people just buying themselves a gameplay advantage. There was also one other thing in this update that generally wasn't really commented on at the time, but I think is worth mentioning during this full history of the Atom Store, which is wallpaper. Wallpaper was introduced, and it was a very interesting item indeed, because up to this point, the Atom Store overwhelmingly sold extra iterations of stuff you could already have in the main game. So in the main game, there was a bunch of clothing, but if you wanted to, you could have extra clothing from the store. You had a selection of hairstyles available to you, you could buy more hairstyles from the store. Loads of icons available to you, but others available in the store. Wallpaper was different, because there is no wallpaper in the base game. Either you have totally bare walls, or you have to go into the store and buy some wallpaper. There is no wallpaper whatsoever outside of purchasing it with atoms. Again, this wasn't really commented on at the time, but it set a precedent we'll be revisiting in a moment, whereby it was okay for entirely new type of items to be created inside the store that had no equivalent whatsoever in the base game. And of course, it should barely even need pointing out by now, but yes indeed, there was a brand new bundle introduced at this point too, the Down Home Dweller bundle. 1,000 atoms if you wanted the exclusive statue inside that was mixed in with a bunch of items that otherwise you would have been able to buy individually. Now perhaps in response to the backlash against the Collectron and the fridge, October 17th is where things start getting very, very interesting indeed. We got our clearest communication yet about the state of the game. Firstly, it was announced that imminently private servers would be arriving as a paid service, but arguably, and to my mind more interestingly, an update on the financial blend that underpinned the game. To quote the update, our approach to these items at launch was to keep them purely cosmetic, but after looking at all the data, it became clear that to consistently deliver content that keeps Fallout 76 fresh and exciting for all, we needed to rethink our approach to the atomic shop. Effectively, this is a fairly overt admission that a purely cosmetic shop had not been making enough money, and that the financial plan behind Fallout 76 had changed to include utility items in the shop going forward. Pete Hines would actually provide a tiny bit more detail the very next day on Twitter when he confirmed that the utility items had been very successful in the shop so far, and that the financial plan underpinning Fallout 76 had indeed changed to include them. This of course led almost immediately into Update 14, the update with private servers, or to give them their final name, the Fallout First service, and yeah, this is where things get very, very interesting indeed. Fallout First was announced and simultaneously launched, but on top of providing private servers, it was a more general offering, also including special armors and icons that were reserved exclusively for their users, which once again, just like the 3 convention bonus outfits, were now permanently locked behind a paywall. More outfits that could never under any circumstances be purchased with atoms that were earned in-game. Now Fallout First, as I'm sure you noticed, received a lot of mockery, but to my mind, a lot of it sort of missed the point of Fallout First, which is, I don't think Bethesda ever thought or ever believed that this was a thing they were going to be selling to everybody who was playing the game, and the key clue for me is the atoms that are included within Fallout First membership. As long as you're a member of Fallout First, you receive 1,650 atoms every month. Now, that's interesting. That's very, very interesting indeed. Because that to mine gives you a pretty clear idea who this is actually for. It's for a minority of players who are already frequent players and, given the atoms, probably frequent spenders, because the price of the monthly subscription was broadly the same as just buying that many atoms. If you were going to be buying that many atoms regardless, it made perfect sense to sign up to Fallout first. You just got some extra stuff on top of the atoms too. But let's dig into the motivations a bit here. From Bethesda's side, obviously it makes life a lot easier just speaking financially, because it makes revenue more predictable. As soon as you've got a certain number of people in these plans and you understand the churn rate, the proportion of people who fail to renew and thus drop out on average every month, you can confidently predict revenue going forward, which is always going to be welcome. But perhaps more importantly, it changes the consumer thought process. When you're buying atoms if and when you decide you want a shop item, the consideration is, do I want this enough to justify buying the atoms? But as soon as you already have the atoms as part of your subscription, then it's just a question of what you're going to spend them on, what you like most, rather than whether you like anything at all. And of course, maybe most importantly of all for Bethesda, it takes the most hardcore player base, of which there is clearly a significant number, and converts those people into regular subscribers. Now that could potentially tell us a lot about the new financial model that Bethesda's pursuing, because we already know the plan to monetize the general community through the Atom Store isn't working perfectly. Could the new plan be to more extensively monetize the existing hardcore player base? And to use that rather unpleasant dehumanizing term, was this about getting more out of the whales? Whether or not that was explicitly the plan, it does seem a likely result. A person committed enough to the game to join Fallout first will almost certainly be yielding more per month than a non-subscriber. But that wasn't actually the only thing to happen on October 23rd, though obviously everything else did get a bit trampled under the narrative of Fallout first. You see, the following things all entered the Atomic Store on October the 23rd. 1. A massive one-day sale of previous bundles, all of which had 30% off. 2. The ability to customise your loot bag. Again, just like wallpaper, there was no equivalent of this in the base game. In the base game, you just had your loot bag, it looked like what it looked like. There was no option to change it whatsoever. The only personalisation available was exclusively through the Atom Store. And 3. A brand new Halloween camp bundle, which, yes indeed, had itself an exclusive item. In fact, it was a second smoke machine, just like the Mothman bundle that had kicked off the exclusive bundle several months before. And that wasn't all, because between October 23rd and October 29th, a huge number of new items entered the store for Halloween, almost every single one of them time limited. This was 16 items and 2 bundles. The combined cost of purchasing all of it was 8,000 atoms. Absolutely all of it time limited. You may remember I mentioned earlier, keep an eye on the total combined value of new time limited stuff being added into the store, because I believe that is the highest amount added in a single week since the madness of Christmas 2018. But there was one other small thing as well, something so small I didn't even realise it till I went to actually go and check, which is so many items were added that were time limited, there was in fact only a single new item added to the store that wasn't time limited. Skip forward a few weeks to the Thanksgiving update of November 26th, and basically the same thing happens. 5 new Thanksgiving-themed items are added, at a fairly modest combined cost of 2,800 atoms, it must be said, but, once again, only a single non-time limited item was introduced. At this point, the vast majority of items being added into the store are time limited. Almost nothing's being added in that isn't. You see, because so many items that are being introduced are time limited, and thus drop out of the store after a few days, and even items that are returning having previously been taken away are time limited themselves, so once again, they drop out almost immediately, the store is actually weirdly empty at the minute. In fact, it's emptier now than it was at launch. So if we just have a quick look through the apparel tab here, this was recorded on December the 6th, by the way. Let's see how many items of clothing I'm actually allowed to buy. So we've got the Scarecrow here, but that will be gone in 4 days' time. Ditto to the Cryptid Enthusiast right here, gone in 4 days' time. Vampire, that time limit's only on the sale, so that will be remaining in a few days' time. Then we've got ourselves the denim suit right here. Pristine Mow the Mole. This doesn't count because this is skins and paint rather than an actual outfit. These 2 bundles are just selling these outfits right here. So we've got ourselves Survivalist and Revolutionary, but again, both of those are gone in 4 days. And then skipping down to the bottom, we've got ourselves the Stars and Stripes Ops Under Armour, but That's it. That's literally everything available in the store. Everything else showing up here is stuff I've previously unlocked. That's literally it. So by my count, that's 6 outfits and 1 bit of Under Armour. That's literally all I could buy in the store right now, because Bethesda have become so obsessed with everything being time limited that things just sort of disappear. And there's nothing actually, you know, left. In fact, if I just very quickly go back to that screenshot we had right at the beginning, the state of the shop back on day 1, launch day, there are 8 outfits right there, and you can see I would be able to scroll. There were a lot more outfits. Somehow, despite the large number of outfits that have been created over the last year, there are now less outfits in the shop now than there were on launch day, which just feels insane. And that broadly is where we are now, a very odd position for the Atom Store indeed to my mind. Starting off as just a simple cosmetic store, the Atom Store's changed a lot over the last year, and we now know that's in part because the original model just wasn't working for Bethesda, and that moving from selling just cosmetics to selling convenience has been successful, at least from a purely financial perspective. But the game's got some really big changes coming up. Fallout First is still fresh, and to date, Bethesda hasn't confirmed how well Fallout First is performing next to their expectations, and likely they never will. But if the subscription revenue can keep the game going, that could change the balance of how much effort goes into new stuff for the general shop versus the subscribers. On the other hand, the performance of Wastelanders will matter a huge amount as well. If that turns out to be successful, and maybe even claws back enough goodwill that a relaunch on Steam could reinvigorate the player base somewhat, that could change the balance of monetization options too, pushing the balance back in favour of a store that very likely will be seeing more utility items in future, regardless. I'll be watching with great interest what happens over the next year, and in particular, what gets announced in the E3 showcase, because the priorities there could very easily inform us which part of the player base is actually making money. It's a fascinating one. It's a really fascinating one, and I'll definitely say the water's definitely warmer than it was. It might get hotter yet too. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
We have got a gate key here, and then we have got I've made a mistake, I've made a mistake, I've made a mistake, I've made a mistake! This is going to take all of my skill and cunning as a hunter to sort out— Die, you mooing bastards! Die! Die! Go away. Go away, nobody likes you. That was a good idea till it wasn't.